The opinions expressed by the host and guests on Where Did the Road Go are their own and do not represent those of WVBR or its management. Our aim is to explore the fringe, lost civilizations, alternative science, the paranormal, and much more. Join us on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com, where you can send us questions for our live or future guests via email or the live chat room. And remember to subscribe to us on iTunes. And now welcome to this week's edition of Where Did the Road Go?
And this week on Where Did the Road Go, we have with us Mr. Robert Schoch, who is currently in Boston. Are you there, Robert?
I am. I'm in Boston.
Okay, that's what I thought. So, I really appreciate you doing this. I am a big fan of your work.
Thank you.
I actually just finished your latest book.
Wonderful. Forgotten Civilization.
Yes, and how many books do you have out total?
Oh, boy, I don't know.
Well, at least on this subject.
Depends on how you count them, because some are more academic, some are anthologies, but about a dozen.
Okay.
When you count everything. But some of them are very, strictly scientific, technical.
Right, and you are...
I'm a faculty member at Boston University. I've been at Boston University since 1984, full-time, so a long time. And I received my PhD in geology and geophysics at Yale University.
And this kind of gives you a head, you're a bit ahead of all the other researchers in this field, because most of them are not from an accredited university who are doing this work.
Yeah, that's actually true. I certainly don't want to put anyone down, but in this field of what everyone wants to call it, alternative history, sort of non-traditional studies of ancient history, that type of thing, I'm one of the few, I'm the only one I can think of offhand, that's really involved in this, that is at a university that has a PhD in, applicable field, that type of thing. Again, I'm not trying to sound the wrong way, but...
Oh, no.
Your point is true.
It makes it a little harder for the mainstream scientists to dismiss you, though. They can't just say, well, he doesn't have a degree, so what does he know?
This is true.
Can you talk a little bit about how you got involved in this alternative history field a little quickly, just for people who are not familiar with you?
Yeah, I can do it. I'll try to do it quickly. I've actually always been interested in ancient history and archaeology and ancient cultures. I sort of have a very broad general background in some ways, going back to childhood. If people know what theosophy is, my grandmother, who's now deceased, she was a old-time theosophist. She had been a theosophist in Europe and brought that to America, and I actually was exposed to a lot of, shall we say, non-conventional ideas and concepts through her, even as a young child. I went to college at George Washington University. I got degrees in geology. I got another degree in anthropology because I was interested in so many things. Then I went to Yale University to get my PhD, and I got my PhD in geology and geophysics, along with a couple of masters in geology and in geophysics. Then I decided to stay in academia, and rather than get a job with an oil company or something like that, I went to Boston University, and I've been teaching full-time since then, since 1984 at Boston University, and I was a straightforward, shall we say, academic geologist until about 1989 or so, and at that time, there was a fellow faculty member at Boston University who was an English professor, and he had spent time in Cairo, in Egypt, teaching at the American University in Cairo. And while he was there, he came to know a fellow that some of the listeners may know of, and that is John Anthony West, an independent Egyptologist. So John West had made friends with this English professor who was now teaching at Boston University. I had become friends with him, and something that John West had mentioned to the English professor was that he was actually looking for a geologist to help with his studies in ancient Egypt, and particularly to look at the Great Sphinx and reevaluate the Great Sphinx in terms of its age from a geological perspective. So in the late 1980s, I was introduced to John Anthony West. We sort of got along right away, and he has become a very close friend for the last, 24, 25 years. So he really got me re-involved in something I had loved as a child, and I've been doing it ever since now for over 20 years.
Now, did you expect the reaction you got from the archaeological community when you came forth with your evidence on the dating of the Sphinx?
No, I really didn't. I was naive. And just so everyone knows what we're talking about, the Sphinx is traditionally dated to about 2500 BC. That's the status quo Egyptological conventional point of view. It was built in the 4th dynasty, 2500 BC, by the pharaoh Khafra or Chephren. And I went over there first in 1990. My first actual trip to Egypt was 1990. I was evaluating it geologically. I did seismic studies around it to look at subsurface weathering, and I did a lot of research on it. And what I came to conclude was that the core body, the lion's body of the Sphinx, basically, was eroded not by wind and sand, as you expect in the Sahara Desert, but by water, by precipitation. It was not Nile flooding, I want to make that clear, but precipitation by rain beating down. So this immediately suggested that the body of the Sphinx was pre-Sahara, which means it's pre-3000 BC, and given the level of erosion, given the level of weathering, it had to go back at least several thousand years prior to 3000 BC. So I did this geologically. I felt very good data. I presented it at the Geological Society of America initially in 1991. My fellow geologists found it very fascinating. They virtually unanimously agreed with me. In fact, some of them said, look, it's so simple, it's so straightforward. Where were the Egyptologists? Why hadn't they noticed this before? And so, it actually made headlines at the time that, the Sphinx, at least the oldest portions of the Sphinx, go back much earlier. I just want to mention that the head has been recarved, so it's not the original head, but the oldest portions of the body go back much earlier. So my geological colleagues were fine with this. They agreed with me. They supported me. But almost immediately, within 24 hours, Egyptologists were calling in. Reporters were talking about their research for the New York Times or the LA Times. They would then ask Egyptologists what they thought, and the reaction of the Egyptologists was absolutely the opposite from the geologists. They basically said this was impossible, it can't be, they don't know any geology, but they know Egyptology, and they know that nothing in ancient Egypt goes back that far of such an advanced nature. So they actually came after me like crazy. They called me a pseudoscientist, all kinds of name calling, That's what you do, I guess, when you don't have evidence. And it got very bitter. It got very nasty, especially through the 1990s. And I was naive. I actually did not expect that. I thought that it was an interesting problem. I thought that I was giving essentially the Egyptologists more to work with, because I was not denying ancient dynastic Egypt. I was saying things go back further. Okay, so you've got even more to study, more interesting things, but they did not take it that way.
And you have some great anecdotes in your book about this whole situation and some of the stuff that happened. And people will always say you can't date stone, but you basically did by checking out the erosion like a geologist can.
Exactly, because you can look at erosion patterns, you can fit that to climatic patterns. We have a very good sense of geologically what the climate has been and how it's changed over time in North Africa. Also, we did seismic work. When I say we, Thomas DeVecchia, a geophysicist, and myself, did seismic work around the Sphinx. So we looked at subsurface weathering, not erosion, but subsurface mineralogical changes, that type of weathering. And you can calibrate that, as it weathers for a longer period of time, it goes deeper into the rock, and you can calibrate that. And we did that independently of the surface weathering, and came to the same results.
And what do the Egyptologists base their dating on?
They base it on context. That's really the simplest way to say it, because there are no records that explicitly state when the Sphinx was built or who built it. There is a granite stela that is from about 1400 BC that, when it was initially found, supposedly had the name of Khafra on it, but it was not clear what the context was, and some Egyptologists claim, well, that meant that Khafra built the Sphinx. Actually, what I think it meant, and I have good basis for this, is that Khafra actually dug the Sphinx out of the sand, as it's been dug out of the sand many times over the last 3,000 to 4,000 years. So they base it primarily, actually not primarily, solely on context. The Great Pyramid sits just to the north of the Sphinx, to the northwest of the Sphinx. The second pyramid sits due west of the Sphinx, and then the third pyramid sits to the southwest, basically. And they date those pyramids to the 4th dynasty, more or less from 26 to 2400 BC. And they say the Sphinx is part of that complex, therefore it must have the same date. Sometimes I make the point that you can go to a great city like Rome, you can see the Colosseum from the 1st century AD, and then you can see modern buildings built in the 20th or 21st century. If we fast forward 3,000, 4,000 years from now, it would be the same as archaeologists in the future saying, well, these buildings that we know are the 20th century and the Colosseum that we know is 2,000 years earlier, they would say, oh, they're in the same context. They're just a couple of blocks from each other. They must all be the same age.
Right.
To me, it's just faulty reasoning. I think what happened is that you have a very important site, we'll call it a sacred site, that was used for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, and you had, I'll call it the proto-Sphinx there, and the dynastic Egyptians took it over, and they built and rebuilt and added to much more ancient structures.
Now, one of the biggest arguments that archaeologists used against you was that there was no culture that far back that could have built the Sphinx.
That's correct. In fact, Mark Lehner, the Egyptologist, and it's interesting, he actually got his PhD at Yale also, just coincidentally, but in Egyptology. As far as, I received my PhD in geology and geophysics, and he was there when I have to say it up here. In 1992, this reached such a boiling point that the American Association for the Advancement of Science held a so-called debate on the age of the Sphinx. It was in Chicago. I went there to represent, my redating of the Sphinx. Mark Lehner was the Egyptologist that would head up the rebuttal and argue for the traditional 2500 BC. And it turned out very, very quickly that it became apparent to me very quickly that this was not a real debate. This was basically a setup to try to, I'll use the term lynch me, to try to attack me. Mark Lehner called me a pseudoscientist. He didn't really want to hear the data. He didn't want to hear the analysis. And his rebuttal to me, what he thought was the clinching point of his argument, the core of his argument, was that before about 3000 BC, people did not build things like the Sphinx. They were not civilized enough. They didn't have the technology. They didn't have the willpower. They didn't have the sophistication. They didn't have the organizational skills to build cities, to build the Sphinx, to build things like that. And he made the statement that they were just hunter-gatherers before about 3000 BC. And so my dating was impossible because you just can't have things that sophisticated that far back. and he made a very memorable statement saying, "Show me the pottery shards of any sophisticated civilization anywhere that's, prior to about 3,000 or maybe on the outside 4,000 BC."
So
that stuck with me, and I've been looking for decades since, and we now have an incredible site which confirms what I've been saying about the origins of civilization in southeastern Turkey called Göbekli Tepe. That's really sophisticated, but goes back to 8 to 10,000 BC.
And how excited were you when you heard about this site?
Oh, I was ecstatic because I had to go see it for myself. I've been there several times now. Actually, I'm going back in June. If I'm actually going back, and I'm taking people with me, whoever would like to join, they can go to my website. Can I say my website?
Absolutely.
Yeah, Robert Schoch, and my last name is spelled S-C-H-O-C-H, so it's RobertSchoch, RobertSchoch.com.
And that is also linked on wheredidtheroadgo.com as well.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. I remember you did that. So people should go to my website. They can find out about my book. They can find out about the trip to Göbekli Tepe. But I was ecstatic because Göbekli Tepe is an incredibly sophisticated site. It consists of stone circles of monoliths, sort of like Stonehenge, but much more sophisticated than Stonehenge. Stonehenge itself is dated back to about 2,500 to maybe 3,000 BC, various parts of it. Göbekli Tepe is dated back to 8 to 10,000 BC, so more than twice as old as dynastic Egypt, as things like Stonehenge by conventional dating. And there's no question about Göbekli Tepe. This is not sort of New Age, not to sound the wrong way, but it's not New Age wishful thinking. It is being excavated by Herr Professor Dr. Klaus Schmidt of the German Archaeological Institute. I've talked to him about it. I've met with him on site. I've been there several times now to study it. I'm going back. And he is doing the most meticulous, thorough excavation you can imagine of the site. And he's got all kinds of good dates, radiocarbon dates, what we call in geology stratigraphic dating. So there's absolutely no question this is the real thing. The dates are good. And in answer to Mark Lehner all those years ago, here we have an even more sophisticated site than I could have imagined at an even earlier dating at the end of the last ice age.
And it's not, actually, for people who don't know, it's not that far away from Egypt.
No, it's not. It's not. In fact, we know that the people back then, and we can reconstruct this from different stone objects, stone tools, and that type of thing, where geologically you can figure out the provenance, where certain stones are coming from, because all stones basically have their own signature, and they were trading back and forth. We're talking just if you think of the Middle East, or the southern portion, North Africa with Egypt, and just Göbekli Tepe, if people have a feel for the Middle East, is just above the Syrian-Turkey border, the modern border between Syria and Turkey. So they're not that far away. There's plenty of evidence. It's not, in my mind, an issue. There could have been cultural interaction, trade, that type of thing.
Now, how big is the Göbekli Tepe site?
Göbekli Tepe covers a very large area. It's acres and acres and acres. It consists of these Stonehenge-type circles of monoliths, and there are at least 20-some such circles, and each one is, I'm thinking in meters, 30, some of them are, 10 to 20 meters or so in diameter, so, you're talking 30 to 70 feet or so. So these are big things. The stones themselves, the monoliths, are sort of T-shaped, and the largest that have been excavated so far are 5.5 meters or so tall, so think 18 feet or so. They weigh 10 to 15 tons, so these are not small stones that were carved out, they were moved, they were erected, as I said, in Stonehenge-like circles. And Klaus Schmidt has excavated the better portion of 4 of these circles. They're also known as enclosures. But seismically and from other remote sensing types of geophysics and preliminary shallow excavations he's done to expose the tops of some of them, there's at least 20 other circles. So it's a very large site. I also want to point out that unlike Stonehenge, these monoliths are beautifully carved. They have nice smooth surfaces. They're not just big rough-hewn blocks that were moved into place. And not only do they have smooth surfaces, but they have carvings on the surfaces. So they have animals carved in them. There's statues that have been found there. Stone statues have been found. Some of the monoliths have not only animals carved in relief on them, but and those animals vary from foxes to cattle to various birds. But some of the monoliths actually are anthropoid or humanoid. They have arms, they have beautiful hands, they have belts, they have loincloths on them, so they're actually huge statues. Somewhat similar in many ways in terms of the certain stylistic features to the moai, the big heads and torsos on the Easter Island, interestingly enough. But they're very sophisticated. If one found them out of context, probably the typical archaeologist would have thought they were about 1000 BC rather than 8 to 10,000 BC. They're that sophisticated. They're that beautifully carved.
Wow. Isn't there some theories that they might also have some sound interactions with them?
Yes, there is. And one thing that's very interesting and adds to the level of sophistication is that these monoliths at Göbekli Tepe, no one really knows exactly to this day how they, what they were like when they were originally built. What I mean by that is that they're very tall. They're actually very tall and very thin, which is harder to carve than a big chunky monolith. And furthermore, they're set into the bedrock very shallowly, and they actually used a form of cement to cement them into the bedrock, but it's not a situation where they carved down, several meters into the bedrock and set them into place so they wouldn't fall over. They're set very shallowly, just a few inches in some cases. And there's a very good suggestion that they were meant to be sitting there and they could actually vibrate. And may have been like huge tuning forks initially, which is a very interesting concept, that they may have been actually generating sound or bouncing sound. And we know that in many cases, at least there's a hypothesis, which I think is a good hypothesis, in many cases certain ancient sites, and it may have included Göbekli Tepe, were meant to hum or resonate or produce sounds that would have an effect on the humans.
Like on consciousness? On consciousness in general?
Yes, having consciousness and affecting your mood, affecting your consciousness, affecting your, should we say, thought abilities. I mean, we know to this day, a lot of people don't want to acknowledge it perhaps, but sound affects mood, affects consciousness, affects thinking ability, it affects, we'll call it psychic ability, that type of thing. And one thing that may have been occurring at Göbekli Tepe, as well as other ancient sites, is that they were using sound in a very sophisticated way.
Now, how old is the site definitely?
Göbekli Tepe?
Yeah.
It's definitely, well, the oldest portions are definitely 9 to 10,000 BC. The entire site was purposefully buried by 8,000 BC. So one thing that's really interesting about it is it's not like most archaeological sites where it was used, reused, because when that happens, of course, you know, the older portions get destroyed, they get damaged by the reuse, or many archaeological sites, instead of being reused for thousands of years, they're abandoned, but they're simply abandoned, they're left to the wind, they're left to the rain, and they're left to vandalism, and they slowly get filled over and covered over. So what archaeologists find is a bunch of ruins, ultimately. Göbekli Tepe is different. It was used and reused for, by my estimate, about 2,000 years or so, maybe longer. But it was, and this is the important point, it was absolutely intentionally, and you can see that geologically. I looked at it with Professor Schmidt on site. It was intentionally buried by the people who were using it last, and this was by 8,000 BC. So the whole site was intentionally buried and covered up by 8,000 BC. Before they buried it, they even re-erected some of the pillars that looked like they had been knocked over. They put them into position, then buried the whole site under essentially a small artificial mountain.
Which had been a lot of work.
Serious about burying it. It was a lot of work. As Professor Schmidt said to me, every indication is the time and manpower, human power, and human hours that went into burying it may have been as much or more as it took to erect it in the first place.
Now, how has mainstream archaeology been dealing with this? Because they can't just say it's a false reading because they've accepted the dating on it.
Yeah, they've accepted the dating, but it's very interesting. They haven't really accepted the implications of it. It's just starting to sort of work into their consciousness, and I've been following this and, you know, reading the technical literature and whatnot, and it's like they don't want to really accept it. They don't want to acknowledge the implications of it. They keep sort of downplaying it. Even Professor Schmidt, and I have great respect for him, but he calls it the world's first temple. And I don't mean to sound the wrong way. Temples are fine, but that's sort of in archaeology and status quo conventional archaeology. In some ways, when you call something a temple, you sort of dismiss it as having any real significance. More or less, it's sort of, they're those primitive guys that were building a, quote, temple, unquote, and it doesn't really, it sort of indicates a lack of sophistication in some ways, right, that they were just, you know, doing something primitive and worshiping a primitive god, blah, blah, blah. And it's also a way to label something when you don't really know what you're looking at. So they sort of, this is my impression, they sort of are begrudgingly admitting that it exists, but not wanting to follow through with the implications. And I think the implications are pretty straightforward, that it indicates that we had, you know, civilization, what anyone in their right mind, if I could say it that way, not to be nasty, would acknowledge as sophisticated civilization, quite advanced, at a very remote period, thousands of years before the standard story says civilization arose in Egypt and in Sumeria. You know, standard story is civilization rose about 3,000 to 4,000 BC at the earliest. Here we have a site that is, the core of it, the major portion of it's 9 to 10,000 BC, and it didn't just spring from nowhere. There must have been predecessors. There must have been antecedents to it.
Well, not only that, but don't most of these ancient cultures say that they go back to that time period?
Oh, all the ancient cultures, and this is another thing, the arrogance, and I'll use that term, the arrogance of the modern classical, conventional status quo scholars and historians and archaeologists. It amazes me, and again, I don't want to sound nasty, but it amazes me the Egyptologists, they spend their life studying the ancient Egyptians and the culture. This is the classic Egyptologists in modern times, yet they don't acknowledge what the Egyptians were saying about their own culture, about their own history, because the ancient Egyptians, like many of the classical, when I say classical, the last 5,000 years or so, ancient cultures, they would say that they came from a much earlier culture, that they were a re-emergence of civilization, not the first civilization. And modern scholars have always dismissed such stories as, oh, they were just the myths, the creation myths of the ancient people, not that they would have any real credence, not that they would have any real value. And I think that we're finding more and more that the classical ancients, were right, that they were not the first. They were, as I see it now, a re-emergence of civilization after, I'll call it the dark age of thousands of years.
All right, we got to take a quick 45-second break, and we'll be back with Robert Schoch in a minute.
The opinions expressed by the host and guests on Where Did the Road Go are their own and do not represent those of WVBR or its management. Join us on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com, where you can send us questions for our live guests via email or the live chat room. You can also check out our upcoming schedule, blog, link section, book reviews, videos, and links to our Twitter, Facebook, iTunes, and much more. That's wheredidtheroadgo.com.
And our guest tonight on Where Did the Road Go is Robert Schoch, author of Forgotten Civilization. And when did that come out?
That came out late 2012, so it's only been a few months now, as we're just into 2013, so it's very recent.
All right. And one of the big issues you talk about in the book is how the sun may have been a factor in the end of the last ice age and the destruction of this ancient civilization.
Yeah, absolutely, because to paint the story very broadly, I have no doubt at this point, and this is, again, the culmination of decades of research on my part, starting with the Sphinx, I have no doubt that at the end of the last ice age, the period of 8 to 10,000 BC, roughly, the end of the last ice age and just after, we had early civilization, genuine civilization. We see that in Egypt now, once we peel back all the layers of dynastic Egypt and get back further, we have that at Göbekli Tepe, as we were just talking about, in Turkey. And what we have is that early civilization, but it gets knocked out, it gets wiped out. Even when I was Klaus Schmidt excavating Göbekli Tepe, he's made comments that, it was covered over, it was lost, the people disappeared, and there was nothing like it, nothing as sophisticated 1,000 years later. And so I think we need a real explanation of what happened to those early people. We also know geologically that there are major cataclysms, major climatic changes. There was increased volcanic activity, earthquake activity at the end of the last ice age. The end of the last ice age is best dated to about 9,700 BC, based on, in my opinion, the best geological analyses of sediment cores, ice cores, that type of thing. And it has been a real mystery for a very long time. How do you get such dramatic climate changes over a very, very short period of time? And when I say short period of time, the ice core data in particular that's been developed in just the last 10 years indicates that you had dramatic climatic changes, incredibly dramatic, incredible melting of glaciers in a period of just 2 to 3 years, and that's simply, we say 2 to 3 years because you can't resolve it better than that, closer than that, in the sediment core data and the ice core data, but literally it could have been overnight or it could have been within just a couple of weeks. Either way, from a geologic point of view, that's incredibly fast. From a geologist's point of view, 100 years or 1,000 years is incredibly fast for major climate changes like that. But we know it's within just a couple of years. And people have been toying and speculating as to what could cause this, and I think we now have the answer, and that was a major, major solar outburst. You have to put the geology together with modern astrophysics. We now know that the sun is like any other star. It undergoes periods of quiescence. It undergoes periods of incredible activity, and this seems to be a cycle on the order of about 10 to 12,000 years that it undergoes lots of activity, then it becomes more quiescent. It seems to build up internal, I'll call it stresses and disequilibrium, and then it has to liberate those again, sort of the equivalent of volcanic activity, to use the Earth analogy, and undergoes periods of major, major solar outbursts, and then quiets down again.
And it would take a massive solar outburst to melt ice caps the size of what we
absolutely.
have.
We're talking incredibly massive, but all the indications are that that's what happened at the end of the last ice age. And when I say all the indications, we have the geology, we have cultural evidence, which we can get into, and we have isotope evidence, both from the Earth and actually from the Moon, also from lunar samples, that there was a major, major solar outburst at the end of the last ice age. And we're talking massive discharges, not just big solar flares that people may be familiar with, but what are known as coronal mass ejections, which are big balls of essentially charged or electrified gas, sometimes known as plasma, electrical plasma, and these are thrown off of the sun. The sun is always discharging particles, electrically charged particles. It's known as a solar wind, but you have these big balls or bursts of gas that are given off sometimes, coronal mass ejections, and they can hit the Earth. And this appears to be what happened at the end of the last ice age, that you had a combination of major solar outbursts, and they intersected with the Earth. The Earth was hit by them, and it would have disrupted the atmosphere, it would have disrupted the magnetosphere, it would have had tremendous climatic changes. In some cases, because you had so many charged particles entering the atmosphere and being funneled by the magnetosphere, it would have come down, in some cases, as huge discharge structures, what you would think of as lightning, sort of like lightning, huge lightning bolts hitting the surface. Technically, they wouldn't be lightning, but they would be electrical discharges hitting the surface. In fact, very recently, when I say recently, within the last year, at several sites around the world that are at the end of that last ice age, dated to the end of the last ice age, vitrification, rock that was subjected to incredibly high temperatures to the point where it melted and then re-solidified, has been found at archaeological sites, which, I think the only good explanation for it is a major solar outburst. The other competing explanation that some people have suggested is that a comet exploded and caused some of these effects. The thing about comet is it doesn't give all the effects that you need to end an ice age. It doesn't give the same isotope signature as you get with a major solar outburst. So I think it was a major solar outburst at the very end of the last ice age. Interestingly, just to complete the story, about 1,200 years before the end of the last ice age, there is good evidence for a comet or meteorite exploding in the atmosphere, which actually caused a temporary cooling effect. It's very interesting. At the end of the last ice age, it sort of started to warm, then you have a dramatic cooling effect, and then snap warming effect at 9700 BC.
And that must have devastated any civilizations that were
It would have
around.
devastated any civilization because you would have had these electrical discharges. They would not only melt rock, the vitrification I was talking about, they would melt glaciers in a snap. When you melt glaciers in a snap, there's a lot of ramifications because you release all kinds of pressure from the crust of the Earth. This has ramifications in terms of setting off earthquakes, increased volcanic activity. We actually see this in Iceland now, so this is not just theoretical. And Iceland has increased volcanic and earthquake activity due to the pressure being released as the glacier there melts, the major glacier. And that's not melting very quickly compared to end of the last ice age conditions. Also, forest fires would have been set, and you would have had literal incineration in some parts of the Earth, not everywhere. So think of a tornado that sets down certain places and not other places. But it would have been very rough. And something that's very important is it would have messed up the magnetosphere and the stratosphere, the ozone layer, for instance, in particular. So you would have had increased levels of radiation at the surface of the Earth. And there's been some very nice modeling of what happened on the surface of the Earth, or could have happened, by a physicist who I have a lot of respect for, Dr. Paul Violetta. And he has calculated that radiation levels due to this event could have been so high on the surface of the Earth that exposures in some cases could have killed off large mammals, things like mastodons and mammoths, which is exactly what we see. And another large mammal is humans. So humans could have suffered badly. The best way to escape it would be to go underground into natural caves or to carve artificial shelters in stone or into cliffs, that type of thing. And interestingly, some archaeologists have pointed out that at the end of the last ice age, inexplicably to them, people were going into caves and building underground, shelters.
Well, you have underground cities in Turkey.
Oh yeah. In fact, when I go back to Turkey, I once again will be looking at these. I think I mentioned that I'm going in June, and people are welcome to join me if they like. But in Cappadocia in Turkey, you have these underground city complexes. Some of them are 8 stories or more below ground, different levels. And I believe that this goes back, the earliest portions of them go back to the end of the last ice age. And people carried a remembrance of what happened for a very long time, thinking this could happen again, and it will happen again. And I also want to make the point that you don't just have one major solar outburst. You have one, then the sun sort of calms down, but then you have another one, so they sort of come in waves. So it's not like it wouldn't kill everyone and no one's left. It would come in waves, it would cause destruction. Sort of, I hate to use a war analogy, but sort of like an air, bombing raid. They come and they bomb, then they let up. But you learn, you make preparations for the next time.
And don't the Hopi Indians also have a story of the ant people who saved them from this?
Yes, the ant people saved them from this, and they have the legend that their ancestors emerged from below ground. In fact, more than one culture around the world has that legend that their ancestors lived in caves. I was on Easter Island recently. I've been to Easter Island with my wife a couple of times, and unsolicited, he had no clue where I was coming from. We weren't talking about this, but one of our guides talked about how one of the legends on Easter Island, or one of the ancestral stories, is that people lived in the caves on Easter Island. There are lots of caves on Easter Island. They're natural caves, but they were clearly used by the inhabitants because they've been modified, that type of thing. How the people had to live in caves for 1,000 years because conditions were so bad on the surface.
Now, do you want to talk a little about the Rongo Rongo script and the connections
because that
here?
ties right in. So so I learned this story on Easter Island, which ties right in with what I've been talking about, and he had no clue I was interested in such things. And what we have on Easter Island, which is another piece of the puzzle, is the Rongo Rongo script. And the Rongo Rongo script is a sort of hieroglyphic script. That's how it's been described. And it sort of has these weird, we'll call them not exactly stick figures, but figures of humans and bird-headed, humanoid shapes, etc., etc. It turns out when you have a major solar outburst, major solar outburst, and we've not seen anything this major in recorded history. The closest we have is the Carrington event in 1859, which would have been orders of magnitude less than we're talking about for the end of the last ice age. But when you have a major solar outburst, you see configurations in the sky. People should think of the aurora borealis, the northern lights or the southern lights, aurora australis. When you have major solar outbursts with major electrical discharges, these structures, these things you see in the sky become more distinct. And a fellow at Los Alamos National Laboratory, Dr. Anthony Perrott, has done a lot of work modeling exactly what you would see in the sky during a major solar outburst. And what you would see could be interpreted, would look sort of like stick figures, humanoid stick figures, but with weird shapes, with sort of extra sort of dots on their sides. A lot of times they would take on sort of bird head shapes. You would also get what can be referred to as sort of donut shapes, cascading shapes, and this has to do with electrical properties and how they're pinched, literally pinched by magnetic fields, that type of thing. And in fact, these have been seen during not a major solar outburst as we're talking about the last ice age, but the largest solar outburst in historical times, the Carrington event in 1859. People will describe seeing just these types of figures. It turns out that the Rongo Rongo script also records such figures, such configurations, and my wife Katie first pointed this out, that she said to me, look, the Rongo Rongo looks just like the configurations that Dr. Perrott has been modeling for major solar outbursts. I started looking at it, and what I think we have with the Rongo Rongo is, in fact, initially, and it's been passed down, it's been copied and recopied again, so it may have lost something in the copying, iterations, but I think it started out as essentially a record of a solar outburst and what you would see in the sky, and fits that very clearly. Likewise, the moai, the big heads and torsos on Easter Island, look up to the sky, and one of the traditional names for them and the island is eyes gazing at the sky. They have indigenous records of, something was happening in the sky. When the Europeans first asked the natives, the Easter Islanders, the Rapa Nui, about the Rongo Rongo and what it meant, they couldn't really explain it, but they pointed up to the sky and indicated it had something to do with the sky. So I think this starts to fit together, and Dr. Perrott has found similar types of figures, similar to the Rongo Rongo, around the world carved onto rocks. Petroglyphs are called, essentially engravings on rocks going back thousands and thousands of years, I believe back to the end of the last ice age, apparently recording what people were seeing in the sky. And he's even been able to model them and show that these configurations and the orientations of the rock engravings tie together, and the people would have been had the right, what he calls a field of view, to see the configurations as they would come in from a solar outburst.
Now, do you think...
All ties together, and I think this wiped out civilization, and we essentially went into a major dark age for thousands of years before the reemergence of civilization about 3,000 to 4,000 BC.
Do you think the like for instance in Mohenjo-daro and Harappa in India, the cities are said to be radioactive?
Yes, exactly, and some of this could tie back because you would have increased radiation levels on the surface. That's very clear. This could have caused damage, that type of thing. I think it also ties in with what we see. I mentioned vitrification before, but in northern latitudes, especially in Scotland, a lot of them have been preserved, what are known as vitrified forts, where you have a surface vitrification. What that means is that something very intense heat and electrical arcing or electrical discharges could cause that. Very intense heat melted just the surfaces of rocks, and then it resolidified as glass, vitrified. That's what it means. And this whole concept of vitrified, they call them vitrified castles or vitrified forts. I've looked at some of them, and you can see that they're vitrified. You can even reconstruct how whatever was causing it came from one side, came from one direction in the sky, and only caused certain surfaces to be vitrified. And getting back to what you were talking about, I think this could explain some of the radioactivity that you see in some cases at certain sites.
Now, the sites in Scotland, though, wouldn't those be under the ice cap at the time that this solar outburst hit?
No, not necessarily, because the glaciers did not spread evenly all over the surface. In some cases, they retreated. So in the UK, you had places that were exposed, that type of thing. So it wasn't it wasn't as widespread as some people think. You have to be careful with that.
I see. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, because we think of the Ice Age, and the popular view is, the world is totally covered with ice. No, it wasn't totally covered with ice. It's just that the glaciers extended further.
Well, now
the further latitudes than they do now. So it depends where you are and at what time in the Ice Age.
And there's also the whole pole shift theory that because both Alaska and Siberia and Lesser Antarctica seem to be ice-free and fairly warm during the last ice age, people have proposed that the whole Earth had shifted.
Yes, there's a lot of issues because there's a pole shift, there's a magnetic pole versus the actual spin axis, and then you also have to worry about timing, and are you talking the end of the last ice age, 9,700 BC, or are you talking a previous ice age, because we had a whole series of ice ages?
Right.
And so, a lot of times, and I don't want to sound the wrong way, but I get frustrated with certain, how should we say, popular accounts that confuse what was happening, say, at the end of the last ice age with maybe what was happening, say, 30,000 BC, that type of thing, and they sort of lump it all together.
Well,
it gets very complex, unfortunately.
Yeah,
but that's real life.
Randall Carlson had actually suggested that perhaps what caused the pole shift was the sudden melting of the ice from a solar outburst, and then
and then shifted weight, that type of thing. Yeah, exactly. Which there could. I don't think we have a good handle right now on all the ramifications of major melting and major solar outbursts. Like I said, we've not experienced such a major solar outburst in historical times, although I hate to say it, we may well, because all the indications are that the sun is becoming very active now once again. I mentioned the Carrington event in 1859, which was really two coronal mass ejections, very moderate on a geological and astrophysical scale, but they hit the Earth. They caused major, we'll call it Northern Lights, Aurora Borealis, at very low latitude, so people saw it even in Cuba, that type of thing, which they normally would not. It caused major changes in the magnetosphere and the electrical field of the Earth, the magnetic field of the Earth. It fried the telegraph lines at this at that time. If we had even a Carrington event now, it would be devastating to modern civilization.
Now,
but all the indications are is that the sun is getting more active right now.
And I think that's something people miss. Like, people don't realize how important it is to know whether or not there was a civilization. And if they were so wiped off the earth, what happened to them, and could it happen to us?
Yeah, I agree. To me, it's not just, isn't that interesting to study these civilizations? Again, I don't mean to badmouth Egyptologists, but I've met a lot of Egyptologists now and talked to them and spoken at their conferences, and a lot of them, and I just use Egyptologists as an example, they study these ancient civilizations, but it's almost, I'll use the term voyeuristic. It's sort of, aren't they interesting, these primitive people, and it's sort of neat to study them, but of course we're so much smarter. We're not really going to learn anything from them. It's just sort of interesting to study their primitive ways, and I think that's very wrong attitude. I don't think.
And possibly dangerous. And possibly dangerous.
And possibly dangerous, because I think we did have real sophisticated civilization back then. They were no dumber than us. They were different than us, maybe in their technology, and they were devastated by natural changes, by things that were happening in the sun and the effects on the earth, and they could not control it. And frankly, when it happens again, and I have no doubt as a geologist it will happen again, we're not going to be able to control it, and we are going to be ill-prepared if we don't start taking these things seriously. And not only will we be ill-prepared, and we could be utterly devastated as were those earlier civilizations, but we may actually be making ourselves more vulnerable by the day, by the hour, because we are so dependent on our electronics, GPS, everything from GPS, global positioning systems, to satellites for communication, to computers and phones and the electrical grid. And we are, to me, on a collision course, because we're making ourselves more and more vulnerable to a major solar outburst. A major solar outburst, one of the biggest ramifications is going to be electrical and magnetic properties, changes that will occur. And essentially it's an electrical magnetic event, and that will destroy our sophisticated electrical and electronic systems. It will overload grids, for instance, power grids, and blow out transformers. If you start blowing out transformers left and right, the grid system goes down. And if you don't have electricity, our modern civilization is not going to be in good shape, I'll put it that way.
To say the least.
You don't have transportation, you don't have heat, you don't have water supplies. I'm here in Boston, or if you're in New York or any big city, your subways start flooding. You can't pump gasoline. You can't run backup generators once you run out of fuel, and there's no way to distribute fuel. You can't even repair the system because you need electricity to run the factories to make new transformers to repair the ones that blew out. I don't want to sound like a scaremonger or doomsayer, but I think we need to take some of these things seriously.
Yeah, and we
can look at our power plants. When you lose electricity, people don't realize this. A nuclear power plant makes electricity. Yes, it does, but it's also dependent on being supplied by electrical grid system to run coolers, to run all kinds of equipment associated with the power plant. And look at something like Fukushima. Yeah. The power gets knocked out, and you start, I think that's been downplayed and covered up how bad it was.
Yeah.
So we've had a few good centuries. This is the way I see it as a geologist. We've had a few good centuries of very stable, relatively inactive sun, very stable conditions on the surface of the earth, geologically even, with not that many earthquakes and tsunamis and whatnot. We've just seen it really nice, calm times for a few centuries, and we as a civilization have sort of concluded, well, that's the way it always is, and that's not the case geologically or astrophysically.
Now, you're on WVBR FM Ithaca. This is Where Did the Road Go? We're going to go a few extra minutes with Robert Schoch. I wanted to cover some of the stuff that you talk about in the last chapter of your book, which is kind of like the state of science and why some of these things are the way they are, why people aren't taking this stuff seriously where they need to. And as you said, when you got into this, you were kind of naive. You expected that if you followed the facts and presented the evidence, it would be accepted as it should be if science worked the way it does.
Right, and the problem is, and I think I could say it in a nutshell, science, there's two sciences, I'll put it this way. There's the ideal science that you go by the evidence, you go by the data, and you have your models, you have your hypotheses, you have your theories, and if the data is different and discrepant with the theory, you should get rid of the theory, you should revise, et cetera, et cetera. That's the classic textbook model. The reality is that, of course, science is pursued by scientists. Scientists are human, and there's so much politics in science and academia in general, so much in the way of vested interest. People have their own paradigms, they have their own worldviews, they have their research that they want to protect in some cases at all costs. So inconvenient data that's anomalous, data that does not agree with their theory, data that does not agree with their paradigm, their worldview, their how they see the world, is often ignored or purposefully dismissed, just not acknowledged. I use the example in the book, for instance, Nobel Prizes in science are, I guess, a wonderful thing to win. I'd certainly love to win one, but on the other hand, when something wins a Nobel Prize, it becomes dogma. That theory becomes dogma. Well, how can you even question a theory or a quote discovery unquote when someone won a Nobel Prize for it? But in fact, people can win Nobel Prizes for things that are wrong. There are just so many vested interests. It's very hard to, I think, criticize yourself. We have a peer review system where the gatekeepers, sometimes people use that term, of knowledge or what is accepted is controlled by vested interests. They're going to accept and they're going to support what they believe in, what supports their own research, what supports their own pet theories. One classic case, I think, and I talk about this in Forgotten Civilization, is the whole issue of global warming. Now, I don't want to be misquoted or misunderstood. Global warming is absolutely real. The Earth is heating up at the moment, but what seems not to be the case when you actually look at the data is that it's not necessarily all or even primarily human induced. It's not necessarily just human greenhouse gases that are causing global warming. We know that the Earth cycles through warm and cold periods. We have glaciers, we have interglacials, we have the end of the last ice age, long before humans had the ability to add significant amounts of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. And we have very good data going back thousands of years that solar activity correlates with climatic changes. So there's something else going on. It's not just, and I don't want to badmouth anyone, but it's not just Al Gore's theory of human-induced global warming, even if he did win a Nobel Prize for that.
And that's not to say we shouldn't clean up the planet, and we shouldn't...
No. I want to say there are very good reasons to clean up the planet. I'm a geologist. I know very strongly, I mean, we should not be using fossil fuels as we are. And there are other reasons besides global warming. There are limited supplies. They're causing major pollution otherwise. They're just bad all around. So there's every reason. And in fact, the data indicates that the human component, there is a human component to global warming, which has really kicked in since the 1980s or so. But that is not the whole story. That's maybe 20, 30% of the story. It's not 100% as some people would have you believe. And to say what I'm saying right now, if I weren't tenured, they might use that as a reason not to tenure me. And to say what I'm saying, certain people with vested interest, and this gets back to it, if they have a huge multi-million-dollar grant to study global warming, and they come out with the conclusion, well, it's not primarily human-induced, they run the risk of losing their job, losing their grant, because they're saying they're going against what the standard paradigm is, and it's actually a multi-billion, even multi-trillion-dollar industry right now supporting human-induced global warming and the ramifications, which has all kinds of economic implications of what we should be doing. So again, my point is not to pick on that particular subject, but there are lots of vested interests, there are lots of economic interests in certain paradigms, in certain worldviews, and certain, promoting certain theories and dismissing other theories.
Well, and that's probably kind of the bee's nest you disturbed in Egypt, where they have their set theories, their set ideas, and you basically came in and said, hey, you're wrong.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, people don't like being told they're wrong. They don't like it, and I learned this the hard way. They don't like the suggestion that maybe what they've believed all along, what they've written lots of papers about, what they've put into print, and that's the ultimate in academia. That it could be wrong, and that they may have to retract it. They may have to change their mind. That they may have to revise, what they had, using the colloquialism, set in stone, and
right.
They don't want to hear that.
Plus, you have to have like a political issue there too, where Egypt doesn't want to be told that maybe Egyptians didn't make the Sphinx.
Yes, that's the other thing. When I first came out with this, for instance, Zahi Hawass, he's now out of power but still in Egypt. He was in charge of antiquities in Egypt in the Mubarak regime. He made all kinds of nasty comments about how I was stealing Egypt from the Egyptians. He charged me, he didn't think I'd ever find out about this because he did it in Arabic in the Arabic newspapers. He said I was, I forget, something like a Zionist agent working for Israel trying to destroy Egyptian history and stuff like that. I mean, it got very, very nasty. And of course, that's not the case at all. And I thought, as I think I said before, I thought I was just giving them more history.
Right, right. Well, that's because
I was extending their history. I wasn't stealing anything. I was giving them more, not less.
But you upset a paradigm that they had been set on for, a century.
Exactly. So I upset their paradigm for the classical Egyptologists, and then it also gets more involved because you get some people who, in Egypt, and I'm not saying anything bad about Muslims or Islam, but they frankly don't care about anything before Muhammad. And just like in America, we have lots of people who, you find an ancient Indian Native American burial mound, a lot of people in America couldn't care less. They say bulldoze it over and build a shopping mall.
Right.
And you have the same attitude in Egypt, and so it only makes matters worse when you say, no, not only do we have ancient Egyptian stuff, but this goes back even further. It's even more important, and that's the last thing they want to hear in some cases from a very pragmatic point of view.
Right.
They get rid of, I've had Egyptians tell me, I had a PhD Egyptian tell me once that he thought the best thing to do with the pyramids would be to just rip them apart and build a huge air-conditioned mall there like they have in Dubai and, attract business.
Wow.
I know. And that's the guy with the PhD.
Do you ever look at the way we've treated these ancient monuments and ancient sites over the years and just think that we're just like stupid children who don't understand what we're dealing with?
Oh, I think that's very much the case. I've more and more come to that conclusion that we are literally kids, we're literally children, and this sort of reminds me, I think I have the quote in Plato, but how, humanity has gone through these cycles before, and every time we start to learn, we start to figure out what happens, we get wiped out and we get knocked back. So we sort of become children again. And yeah, I think we really misinterpret. We don't give enough credit to the earlier, we'll call it cycles of civilization, just how sophisticated they were. Think of our civilization. If everything gets wiped out, incinerated, destroyed, and all you have is a few fragments here and there of some buildings and a little bit of hardware that you don't really know how to interpret. What 10,000 years from now, what would people make of it?
Right. They would have no context for it.
They'd have no context. They'd have no clue. And, every building, I guess, that was big, they would call a temple.
Now, you've done work, you've done some research on psychic phenomenon.
Yeah.
And you've shown that also correlates with the sun.
That is true. Psychic phenomena correlate with the sun, and what's significant is it correlates with the sun. It correlates with geomagnetic patterns, which are the sun effects. So you get different psychic phenomena very strongly associated with basically the geomagnetic field that you have on the Earth, which is really interesting because, of course, the whole business of psychic phenomena, things like telepathy, telepathic communication, I'll just use a general term, clairvoyance, that type of thing, is, among scholars of a traditional ilk, classic academics, they don't even talk about this. They just dismiss it outright. They won't even look at the evidence for it. So I think it's even more important because you have over 100 years of well-documented incidents of psychic nature, should we say, and very careful studies in a couple of cases have been done of when these occurred, where they were occurring, that type of thing, and then you can independently look at the solar activity, the geomagnetic activity, and see if there's a correlation or not. And in fact, there's a very, very strong, robust correlation, which to me has real implications, not only for mechanism or influence on psychic phenomena, but for the reality of the psychic phenomena themselves, because it's very hard to argue that for over 100 years people have been faking this and making it up, and somehow there's been this huge conspiracy that they would always have certain types of psychic phenomena when the geomagnetic field was of a certain nature. Do you see what I'm saying?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. And the only thing that makes sense is, yes, these phenomena are real, and they correlate with other natural phenomena, which, if you're willing to be open-minded and think about logically, that makes a lot of sense. We are influenced by our environment. We're influenced by the electrical fields around us, the geomagnetic fields around us, and we are essentially electrical beings. That's how our cells work. That's how our hardware, I'll call it that way, works.
It also seems like, they discovered the Higgs boson, and the evidence for it is very flimsy, very, very subtle. Yet psychic abilities have far more deep evidence to it, and that's dismissed.
Yeah, it's very interesting, and this is just so people know, if they go to my website, they should definitely read Forgotten Civilization. As you said, I talk about some of these things in the last chapter, put it together. But I've done a lot of research on parapsychology, psi phenomena. I actually did an anthology and commentary called The Parapsychology Revolution. And it's very interesting. I want to make 2 quick points. One is that the evidence for psi, the evidence for psychic phenomena is very strong, very consistent, very robust, including both anecdotal evidence, but anecdotal evidence is evidence, and a lot of it is very well documented. It's just like volcanoes, you could call anecdotal evidence. You can't get a volcano to erupt on command, but when they erupt, they're definitely erupting, and you can measure that, you can study that. Or a meteorite falling out of the atmosphere, falling into the atmosphere, falling from outer space. You can't do that in the lab. You can't reproduce that, and you can't just snap your fingers and say, I want a meteorite to fall now. So that's also anecdotal evidence, but it's still real evidence. A lot of people don't realize that. But when you look at the evidence for psi, both natural evidence or anecdotal evidence and laboratory studies, it's very robust. And when you have studies, for instance, of a new medicine for heart attacks or to ward off this or that disease, often they will find that it has a small but persistent or perceptible effect, and they will say it's a huge breakthrough because it reduces heart attacks by 20% or something like that in a study of 10,000 people. And when you have a study of psi or psychic phenomena, often you have results that are much stronger, much more robust, yet they will dismiss them as, it's such a small effect that doesn't really count for anything, can't really be real. And there you have your paradigms playing into effect, because it's hypocritical. It's a double standard. Stronger evidence for psi phenomena will be dismissed than much weaker evidence for some new drug that someone wants to put on the market. The other thing I wanted to mention, just historically, it's interesting. A lot of the very sophisticated statistical techniques that are used in science nowadays, used in medicine, used in all kinds of studies and analyses, actually originated with the study of psychic phenomena in the 19th, early 20th century, where they realized the early students of the phenomenon, some of whom were Nobel Prize winners, like Richet, who was a physiologist and Nobel Prize winner, and devoted much of his energy in the early 20th century to the study of psychic phenomena. They realized that some of these effects are subtle but persistent, and you need really good statistical analysis to make the case for them. And they developed a lot of modern statistics that is accepted for everything else now than the very phenomena they were developed initially to study.
Wow. All right.
Again, I think it shows people's paradigms and worldviews and what irrationally, I would say, they are unwilling to study just because it doesn't match their worldview. And they just don't want to accept it.
And that's not how science is supposed to work.
No, it's not at all. I mean, you're supposed to be objective, but I'll tell you, most scientists I know, they're not. They're objective within a certain realm, and after that, all their own biases kick in.
All right. Well, give your website one more time so people can check out your stuff.
Yep, it's www.robertschoch, and that's spelled RobertSchoch.com. And I hope people will go there. You'll see links to my latest book and my other books. And if anyone's interested in joining me on a fantastic trip to Turkey in June, I also have a link to that.
And what are the dates on that?
That is June, off the top of my head, June 15th through 28th. Yeah, June 15th through 28th.
And you'll be going, where will you be going on the whole tour?
In Turkey?
Yeah.
We start in Istanbul, and Istanbul is, Constantinople, Byzantium. and we'll spend a day or two in Istanbul, get ourselves oriented, see the sites there, which is incredible. And then we travel by bus. We travel as a group by bus through Turkey, working our way east all the way to Urfa and Göbekli Tepe, the site I was talking about, is just outside of Urfa. And Urfa, as a side note, goes back to Bible times. It's actually the city where the patriarch Abraham, of really the founder, in some ways a founding figure for Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, he came from Urfa in southeastern Turkey. And Göbekli Tepe, this incredible site, 8 to 10,000 BC, is about a 20-minute drive outside of Urfa. So we go from Istanbul to Urfa and everything in between. We look at a number of ancient sites. We do everything from Greco-Roman sites like Ephesus. We look at ancient Troy, the genuine ancient Troy. We go into Cappadocia, and we see the underground cities, that type of thing. We actually will take balloon rides over Cappadocia to see it from the air, which is an incredible experience. If you've never done that, everyone has to do that at some point. We'll take a boat ride up some of the rivers, because there are certain ancient sites that you have to take a boat up to. Some of them are actually underwater, and you can see it from the boat under the crystal clear water. We'll go to a place called Çatalhöyük, which very few people get to go to, which is about 7,000 BC.
Wow.
I don't know, there's just so much.
Yeah.
But it's really sort of a trip back in time, and also for those that are interested, and I've had 100% interest on previous trips, I give sort of talks and lectures along the way to put everything into context so people understand what they're seeing and how it ties in with this new picture of, pushing civilization and what we know back in time.
All right.
Again,
I have one more question for you before I let you go. When you started all of this, could you have imagined where you were going to end up at this point?
No, I really didn't. I was naive once again. And, when I first went to Egypt with John Anthony West, I thought, this will be nice. I'll go on a little excursion to Egypt. It'll be my one and only time to Egypt. I didn't think I'd be going back and back and back and back, and then expanding to all kinds of other countries, looking at the origins of ancient civilization. So, no, it's been a real journey.
Regret a minute of it?
No, not at all. Not at all. I don't even regret the times I was called a pseudoscientist and people were spitting in my face, literally. And now sometimes people say to me, and this shows, I don't want to sound the wrong way, but how naive some people can be, or they don't understand the infighting of academia. I've had more than one person say to me, independently of each other, well, now that, everything's established, you really made the case for the Sphinx. We now have the confirmation with Göbekli Tepe. I bet those Egyptologists, they must have apologized to you by now, right? No, that's not the way it works. I don't ever expect an apology.
Yeah, well.
Yeah.
All right.
All I can expect, the best I can expect, is a begrudging, no longer calling me names.
All right. Well, thank you so much, and thank you for going a little longer with us.
Oh, no problem. It's my pleasure.
And we're going to end things off with some Psyche Corporation and then right into the last exit for the Lost.
Come in. Do you read me? Do you understand the numbers pouring over your connection? Into perfection. 583. Have you heard the singing soaking into our transmission? 21, 34, 55, 89, 144. Whence came this dream that hugs my mind? Behind a curtain, outside of time. Can you hear the ballet it plays, the whirring of the world? Can you hear the ballet getting to the heart of the universe. Ventricles and Tatry heart chambers numbered 1597 and counting. And counting. Can you